Hi everyone. Today will be the first of two classes on deviance. So today we're going through about three-fourths of the chapter, and then we'll wrap up the rest of the chapter during our next class period. So when looking at deviance, we just need to conceptualize it in a few different ways. First of all, we can say that deviance represents any deviation from normative expectations. And typically, we think of kind of negative deviance when something wrong or bad is happening compared to what we expect to happen. But there's, what we can call positive deviance as well. In other words, when somebody's not normal, but they're kind of exceptional, or when something's not as expected, but better than expected. So there's kind of two directions when it comes to deviance. You can deviate from the norm in one way or deviate from the norm in another way. And so when looking at this, we can say that deviance is also both legal and illegal. So think about driving the speed limit. Driving the speed limit is something that is legal, but it's something that we consider to be deviant. We don't expect people to drive 25 miles per hour in a 25 miles per hour zone. Likewise, deviance can be illegal when somebody's going 100 in a 25 mile per hour zone. That's not only illegal, but it's also deviant as well. So we can say that deviance evokes both negative and positive reactions. So again, we can look at kind of the two sides of deviance here. Being a poor student, a teacher would kind of have negative emotions when somebody's doing very poorly in the class, because the norm would be the student's going to be, a good, decent student. But when a student kind of falls below expectations, that will evoke those negative emotions. But on the other hand, when you have an exceptional student, somebody who's not normal, but deviating in a positive direction, that experience will evoke more positive emotions. And finally, we can say that deviance can be both dysfunctional and functional for social life. It can cause a disruption. So if somebody's going, 100 miles per hour in a 25 mile per zone, that's going to be disruptive. Just like if somebody's driving 25 in a 25, that could be disruptive as well. But we can say that deviance can be positive for society because sometimes it can begin to give people a new perspective. And if you have taken my social theory class, we talked about this with Emil Durkheim's piece on the normality of deviance. And basically, we think about somebody like Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a deviant. She was a lawbreaker, but she started to give people a new perspective on racial segregation. And we kind of need those deviants to really get us to think differently about potential different futures. And so the book talks about kind of two different understandings of deviance. Absolute deviance is when you think a deviance is inherent in something. So there's no kind of gray area at all. It's very black and white. This is deviant, this is not. So an example could be, somebody believes that the act of using marijuana is inherently bad. You shouldn't do it. It doesn't matter why you're doing it. It's something that is bad. But on the other hand, you can look at what we call relative deviance. And this is more kind of the opinion of the social psychologist, of the sociologist and the symbolic interactionist. Our relative deviance basically is, deviance will change person to person. What we consider deviant or what we consider normal can change from one person to another person. It can change from one time period to another. Going back to that idea of racial segregation during that time period, people thought it was perfectly normal to segregate people by race, and now that would be considered something deviant today, and from place to place. So depending on kind of where you are, one thing could be normal, but that same thing can be considered abnormal and deviant in a different place. So here, when looking at relative deviance, we can look at marijuana use as normal among marijuana users. So they don't see themselves as being deviant, but simply something that they do, and it becomes normalized amongst themselves. It kind of shows, the relative nature of deviance. So Howard Becker has a very famous book, Outsiders, and Outsiders basically unpacks this theory of deviance from a symbolic interactionist point of view. We talked about it a little bit earlier in the semester One chapter of the book was, becoming the marijuana user, and how it's very kind of interactive in nature if one becomes a regular user. And so throughout the book, he kind of talks about deviant acts, but kind of presents us a larger framework through which we can understand kind of how deviance is a social construct. So the social construction of deviance, according to Becker, kind of starts with rule creators. You need people to basically say, this is wrong and this is right. And these rule creators are people who have positions of authority, positions in which, they can have some type of legitimacy in saying that, this is wrong and this is right. And, just as an example, because when I taught this book, Howard Becker's Outsiders, in my theory class a couple of years ago, we talked about the idea of immigrant caravans. And at this time, all this kind of news was being focused on kind of hyping up these immigrant caravans, coming up north to the United States. And, these things have been going on for a very long time, but only kind of during a certain time period that it started to become stigmatized and seen as something deviant. So you start to have these politicians, these, cable news broadcasters who start to kind of construct, this idea of what used to be considered as something that goes on, but nothing very, bad, to something that is really bad and deviant. And then you have the rule enforcers. So you have the creators of the rules, and you need people to enforce the rules. Here, it can be formal enforcement. We have policing of these caravans, or policing any type of deviance that's being created. And they have informal ways of punishing as well, kind of going back to the news, kind of framing the issue in a very kind of deviant manner. So people have always been coming up to the United States for asylum. Perfectly legal, but this whole issue was kind of turned on its head by politicians and the news media, and a creation of deviance was going on. So how do people understand deviance in terms of how we kind of see and understand other people doing deviant acts? And there's basically two different ways this is done. We can focus on internal factors to explain why people are doing something, or why they have a certain condition that we consider to be deviant. Or we can look at external factors, kind of larger social forces in play that may influence somebody becoming deviant or doing deviance. So when you look at internal factors, typically you kind of see the person as being a bad person. The person lacks morals, lacks values, they're weak. And that, those ideas are kind of used to explain, why the deviance is there. When you focus on the external factors, you kind of look at the larger picture and how the larger picture maybe contributes to the individual and their condition, or the individual and their deviant actions. And when you focus on the larger social forces, typically this is when you can promote social changes, whether it be through cultural change or policy change. When you start to understand kind of the big pictures that promotes deviance, you can start to, change things that would minimize those acts going on. And so again, two different ways of looking at things. You focus on the individual, typically that's your focus, the bad person. If you focus on the situation, if you see the situation as a bad situation and you try to correct the situation, like you would try to perhaps correct the individual. So we're looking at negotiating one's deviant identity. So here, basically, people are kind of seeing you as a deviant, typically projecting that, internal explanation. This person's kind of a bad person, or they're deviant because they lack the morals or whatever. So here we're looking at how people kind of negotiate this kind of projection of deviance onto them. And so a few different ways people can try to negotiate their deviant identities being imposed upon them. They can try to pass as normal. So my theory class, sometimes my intro class, we read Erving Goffman's book on stigma. And he talks about kind of one technique people use when they are stigmatized is they try to pass as normal. So you try to hide stigmatizing attributes. So for example, going back to the idea of the marijuana user, a marijuana user could make sure that she is always, using Visine so her eyes would be clear rather than her eyes being bloodshot, which would be a sign that you're using marijuana. So you have all these different techniques just to kind of hide your deviance. And when you're doing it correctly, you can pass to somebody who's normal rather than coming across to other people as a deviant. And so another technique, you basically only reveal your deviance or your kind of deviant attribute around people who share it. So you only kind of do your deviant acts around other people who are doing it as well. You only kind of reveal your deviant attributes around other people who have the same attributes. So you kind of create these separate worlds. One world you're kind of passing as normal, and another world you're not trying to pass as normal, but you're just kind of among your own people who share your deviance. And finally, the last few pages of your reading for today gets into the neutralization technique. Here is kind of a laundry list of different things that people do, and they can deny a few things, deny any responsibility, deny injury to others or to self, deny that any victims do exist. And here you're just kind of downplaying the situation through the denial. And you kind of convince yourself that you're not deviant, that you're perfectly normal because, nobody's getting hurt. There are no victims and you're not hurting yourself. You can use another technique to kind of neutralize that deviant identity being imposed upon you. You condemn the condemners and basically say, I'm not the problem, you're the problem. And when you do that, again, you're kind of neutralizing the identity being imposed upon you. It's not me, it's you. And then you can appeal to higher loyalties. So you kind of go out to people who will probably agree with you. And when you get their kind of agreements, then again, you kind of push away the other feedback that says you are being deviant. And finally, you can simply claim that you're normal. Everybody's doing it. It's just not me. A lot of people do it. So if a lot of people are doing it, then, it's not deviant, it's normal. So again, all these techniques are used, not trying to pass as normal. You're not trying to simply kind of keep it among your own, but you're trying to kind of minimize kind of the social psychological influence that deviant label has on you by coming up with all these reasoning strategies to convince yourself that the label is unfair and you're perfectly okay, you're perfectly normal. So we'll leave that there for today. We'll continue to look at deviance, kind of the social construction of social problems in our next class. So kind of a shorter class next time, but nevertheless, for the next paper opportunity, we'll be talking a little bit about this class, but then I'll bring in some more information about the next class as well. And those will be kind of the 3 different questions you'll be doing for the deviance paper.